What if I told you that Canada expects over 1 million people to flood across its border in the next 2 years? And what if Britain, once the master of the global stage, now sits alone, abandoned by its allies, begging for scraps from former colonies? You won't believe how these two stories connect to reveal the new world order taking shape before our eyes. I'm Andrew Meet Rich, former analyst for a state-run media outlet who chose truth over comfortable lies. I left that world to bring you the real stories, the ones that expose what's really happening while the mainstream media feeds you distractions. Here's what's coming at you today. First, Trump's deportation machine is about to create the biggest migration crisis in North American history, and Canada is scrambling to prepare for chaos. Second, Brexit Britain has achieved something remarkable. They've managed to become more isolated than any major power in modern history. And here's the terrifying part. These aren't separate stories. If you want the unfiltered truth about where our world is heading, hit that like button now. Subscribe and ring the bell because tomorrow the news could change everything. And if you appreciate independent journalism that doesn't bow to any government or corporate interest, consider supporting this channel through our sponsor link below. Your support keeps me free to tell you what others won't dare to say. Because when immigration becomes a weapon and alliances crumble, ordinary people pay the price. Let me paint you the picture of what's actually happening at the US-Canada border right now. Trump has launched the most aggressive deportation campaign in American history, targeting 11 million undocumented immigrants. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. Canada is about to become collateral damage. The Canada Border Services Agency is reporting asylum claims have already surged by over 400% at key border crossings since Trump took office. Canadian officials are setting up emergency reception facilities along the New York-Quebec border, while the Royal Canadian Mounted Police have been preparing for months with additional agents and vehicles. This isn't speculation anymore. It's happening. And now listen carefully. Trump is using tariffs as weapons, demanding Mexico and Canada solve what he calls this long-simmering problem. He's literally threatening economic warfare unless Canada stops people from crossing. Meanwhile, Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has introduced the Strong Borders Act, essentially copying Trump's playbook to appease him. You see the pattern, right? During Trump's first term, even minor changes to immigration status drove thousands to seek refuge in Canada. This time, he's promising to deport millions. The fear alone is driving migration, as families panic about their futures. Here's where it gets even worse. Canada shares an 8,900-kilometer undefended border with the US, but only has a fraction of the resources needed to monitor it. While the US spends nearly $20 billion on border security, Canada has barely $2.6 billion for its entire border operation. But let me tell you what the politicians won't admit. This isn't about border security. It's about using human suffering as a political weapon. Trump knows exactly what he's doing when he sends people to detention facilities he proudly calls Alligator Alcatraz. The cruelty is the point, designed to terrorize people into self-deportation. And Canada, they're not the humanitarian heroes they pretend to be. Norbert Piché from Jesuit Refugee Service Canada says the new legislation seeks to prevent people from seeking asylum. Critics call Carney's approach a shameful capitulation to racism and xenophobia. Just imagine that for a second. The country that once tweeted, "Welcome to Canada," is now building barriers to keep desperate people out. Why? Because public opinion has turned toxic. Housing costs are crushing Canadian families, and politicians need scapegoats. What do you think? Comment below if you've noticed how quickly compassion disappears when economic pressure mounts. Gallup polling shows American support for lower immigration has jumped from 28% in 2020 to 55% in 2024, and Canada is following the same dark path. The real tragedy here? An additional million arrivals could quickly devolve into an unmanageable crisis, overwhelming services that are already failing Canadian citizens. Politicians created this mess through decades of poor planning, and now vulnerable migrants will bear the consequences. If you're still with me, hit that like button. It tells me you want the truth, not just the headlines. But if you think this is bad, wait until you hear what's happening to Britain, a nation that's managed to alienate every ally it once had. Let me ask you a simple question. What do you call a former global superpower that voted for independence but achieved complete isolation instead? You call it Brexit Britain, and the situation is more desperate than anyone wants to admit. Post-Brexit Britain has become the weak link in European efforts that America sees as isolated and in desperate need of a trade deal. Think about that for a moment. The United States, Britain's supposed closest ally, now views them as a vulnerable target to exploit, not a partner to respect. And now listen carefully. Recent polls show 57% of Scottish voters support independence, meaning the United Kingdom itself might not survive this decade. Britain sends 47% of its exports to the EU, but only 13% to the US, yet they've burned their bridges with Brussels while desperately chasing a trade deal with Washington. Former UN Deputy Secretary General Lord Malloch Brown warns that Britain has become a mangy old lion, reduced to begging for trade deals from former colonies. Can you imagine? The empire that once ruled the seas now pleading with countries it once controlled. Here's where it gets truly pathetic. Britain no longer has a voice when European leaders gather to debate the continent's future. They chose to leave the room where decisions are made, and now they're shocked to discover they can't influence those decisions from the outside. You won't believe this next part. Boris Johnson's government spent months on an integrated review of foreign policy, only to have it collapse because they couldn't reconcile their contradictory promises. They promised global Britain while simultaneously making it impossible to engage globally. Russia has identified Britain as Europe's weakest link, targeting it with fake news, political interference, dirty money, and poison attacks. Putin looks at post-Brexit Britain and sees easy prey, not a formidable opponent. The Salisbury poisoning wasn't just an assassination attempt, it was a message about British weakness. What's the result? Despite Brexit promises of independence, the UK will play only a bit part in future US-EU cooperation. The strongest relationships over the next decade will be between Washington and European capitals, not London. Let me repeat that. Britain chose isolation at the exact moment when global challenges require unprecedented cooperation. Climate change, technological disruption, authoritarian aggression, these problems demand collective action. Yet Britain decided to go it alone. Here's where it gets even worse. If Scotland leaves, England would emerge as a reduced power, potentially becoming either an isolated Little England or desperately clinging to past glories as Little Britain. Either way, it's a recipe for irrelevance on the world stage. You see the pattern, right? Britain needs friends in the post-Brexit era, but keeps alienating potential allies through tough rhetoric and unrealistic demands. Like this video and subscribe if you want to keep getting analysis that cuts through the diplomatic niceties to show you what's really happening. Hit that notification bell because these stories are moving fast. Here's what connects these stories and why you should be terrified. Both America and Britain are using immigration as a weapon to divide societies and distract from their own failures. Canada gets caught in the crossfire of American immigration policy, while Britain's isolation makes it vulnerable to every kind of pressure and manipulation. The world order built after World War II is collapsing before our eyes. Alliances that kept peace for decades are fracturing. Countries that once led on humanitarian values are now competing to see who can be cruelest to vulnerable people. And authoritarian leaders like Putin are watching, calculating how to exploit every crack in Western unity. Immigration isn't destroying our societies, political cowardice is. When leaders choose fear over compassion, division over cooperation, they create the very instability they claim to be fighting. Canada's border crisis isn't caused by migrants seeking safety, it's caused by politicians who've spent decades avoiding hard choices about housing, wages, and integration. Britain's isolation isn't the result of EU tyranny, it's the predictable outcome of nationalist fantasies colliding with global reality. You cannot be simultaneously independent and influential in a world where every major challenge crosses borders. What we're witnessing is the rise of politics based on grievance rather than governance. And while politicians play these dangerous games, real people suffer the consequences. Stay informed, stay alert, and demand better from your leaders. Like this video if it opened your eyes to connections you hadn't seen before. Subscribe for analysis that doesn't follow the crowd, and support independent journalism through our sponsor link. Your engagement keeps this channel free from corporate and government influence. The future is being written right now, and the authors are not your friends. I often get asked in the comments, who am I to talk about politics and discuss the news? Fair question, let me tell you. But before I do, I need to say something important. I want to thank the sponsors of this channel, not out of formality, but from the bottom of my heart. Without your support, this wouldn't be possible. Seriously, in a world where honest voices are being pushed out, you make it possible for me to keep speaking freely, without filters, without scripts, without fear. I used to work as an analyst and columnist at a major media outlet. On the surface, it seemed like a dream job, big audience, serious topics, respected platform. But once you step behind the curtain, you see the machine from the inside. Stories that didn't fit the narrative got shelved. Headlines were twisted to spark outrage or push a specific angle. Interviews were edited until the original meaning was barely recognizable. It wasn't about truth, it was about control. And once you start noticing it, you can't unsee it. I tried to fight it from within, to write honestly, to speak up in editorial meetings. But eventually I realized the system isn't broken, it's built this way. That's when I made the hardest decision of my life, to walk away, to give up the security, the paycheck, the prestige, but also to reclaim my voice. Freedom of speech isn't some abstract ideal to me, it's deeply personal. It means being able to look people in the eye and say what you really think, without someone in a suit whispering in your ear to tone it down. That's why I started this channel. This is where I speak freely, where I ask the questions no one else dares to ask, where I'm not afraid to challenge anyone, left, right, or center. If you're still here, if this resonates with you even a little, please hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe. It helps more than you think.